Hey guys, welcome to How to Write Orchestral Music Part 3. If you haven't seen the first two parts, you're going to want to watch those first, so here's the links in case you missed that. So now that we have our orchestra arranged the way we like, it's time to balance everything and to get all the instruments to sound a little more realistic. Now I didn't spend too much time on realism because this is just a demo, but I still think this sounds pretty good. On most mixes you would start with just balancing the faders and getting things panned properly, then you would go into EQ and compression, and then the last thing you would do is add reverb and all your effects. But in the orchestra, reverb plays a really big part in creating that realism and balance in your orchestra. Unlike most music, in the orchestra, we're not recording each individual instrument. We're recording all of the instruments together in one room. So the orchestra is laid out in a way that is already fairly balanced. Because of this, you have to think a little more three-dimensional with the orchestra. Not only are we adjusting the volume and the position, but also the depth, how close and how far away the instruments are. Just because you turn the volume down on something doesn't necessarily make it sound like it's further away from you. So in order to create that distance, we need reverb. So a good example of this is the violins and the brass. The violins are in the front of the orchestra, so they're going to be a little bit drier than everything else. So go ahead and listen to these strings and pay attention to the reverb. The reverb's there, but it's still pretty dry. The trumpets, on the other hand, are in the back of the orchestra, so they're going to have a lot more reverb to create that sense of distance. So before we adjust the faders, we need to get the wetness right. Now there are actual plugins to help create virtual spaces for instruments by moving them further back and closer, but I don't have anything like that, so this is the only trick I really know how to do. So I'm basically using two buses. You'll notice that all of my instruments are sent to bus 2. Now all this is a mix bus, and the reason I'm using this is because I do like to use some plugins that affect my whole mix, and instead of just using the main output, I created another output that happens before the main output, and this one will be used to affect all my tracks. And I did that so that my reference tracks are not affected when I add plugins. If I add EQ and compression here and then I want to compare it to my reference track, I don't want to have to bypass all that just so I can hear the reference track the way it is. So that just kind of helps keep things a little more organized and simpler. And then the other bus I have is a room bus. Instead of actually outputting things to this, I'm sending them to this room. And not everything is being sent equally. So you can see here with the strings, they're being sent negative 15 dB into the room. And then the trumpets are being sent negative 10 dB into the room, while the clarinets are being sent negative 12 dB into the room. So everything's going to this bus, and the only thing I have on this bus here is a plugin. I really like this plugin. It's called Space Designer. This is cool because it does create that kind of illusion of putting that instrument in a room. You have choices here from large, medium, and small spaces. You can choose room, halls, and plates. To kind of put everything in the same room, that's what I like to do, is just send them to a bus that's using the same reverb. Now the reverb I'm using here, I think I actually downloaded this from somebody else on YouTube. There's a guy named Andrew who posts really great tutorial videos on Midi Orchestra. So I'll have a link to that, and he did a video creating a template for the orchestra. And that was very helpful for me for kind of learning what kind of things he did to make it sound more realistic. So I'll send you a link to that, and hopefully you can get the download. But off of that template, he had this room reverb created, and that's what I'm using here. But all it is, it's the soft hall, which can be found in the large spaces and the halls right there. So soft hall. We've got dry set to negative 8.4 and reverb set to negative 9.4. And then for the EQ, we're cutting off about 9.5 dB at 5,600 hertz. And then at about 200 hertz, we've got about a 0.6 dB boost. That seemed to work well for him, so I just went ahead and slapped that on here. But you can experiment with other reverbs if you'd like to. I definitely recommend doing a little research. There's a lot of articles out there about the position of the orchestra and giving tips on how much reverb you should add to each instrument. It's also really helpful to use reference tracks. If you look at my reference tracks, I've got more than one because all of these are by the same composer and they're all kind of similar to mine, but they each have different instruments that they kind of focus on. Like this one has a lot of brass in it, so I would use this to compare my brass to it. This one's just sort of a nice orchestral flow. This one has some really intense strings, and this one is the whole orchestra, but much more intense. So it's helpful to listen to your reference track and pay attention to how they're using the reverb and try to get yours to match as closely as possible. It takes a lot of balancing, moving around. A lot of times I like to use my headphones because you can hear those details a little better, and you want to be careful not to go overboard with reverb because it can really help your orchestra, but it can also make things really messy and just ruin everything. So be really subtle with it at first, and if you feel like you need more, you can bump it up a little bit. So sending all your instruments to a bus is a really good way to get the right amount of wetness, but the only problem is the more you send it to the reverb, the louder it's going to get, and it should be the opposite. As it gets quieter, it should get wetter. And I don't really have a way around that, so really just try to get the wetness right first, and then you can start using the faders to create the right volume. You also want to make sure you pan everything properly, so to do that, you can just Google image orchestral panning. There's a lot of charts that sort of show where all the instruments are at in the orchestra. So as you're setting your faders, really be sure to use your reference tracks. Listen to the low end and listen how loud it is and try to get yours to match that. Listen to the trumpets and where they're at. They're kind of tricky because they're loud, but you don't want them to be blaring over the rest of the orchestra. Once you've got everything nice and balanced, this next part is super important. This is one of the big things that really helped make this mix come out a lot better, something I hadn't done before, and that is to switch to mono. Now, most DAWs have a button that you just click and it switches to mono, but this doesn't work that way. It'll change the meter to mono, but it still plays in stereo. So on the master fader, not the mix bus, the master fader, I added this gain plugin, which has a switch here that you can switch to mono. First off, the reason I put this on the master fader is so that it would affect everything. I don't want this just to affect my track, but I want it to affect my references too. And the reason why you want to do this is because the truth is most people are going to hear your music in mono. They're going to be listening to it through a phone or through their laptop speakers, and even if they are listening to stereo speakers, they're probably some distance away, and so by the time it reaches their ears, it's basically mono. But you want to mix in mono so that you can get your track sounding as best as possible in mono. If it sounds good in mono, then it's going to sound awesome in stereo. That doesn't necessarily work the other way around. Plus, if you listen to your reference tracks, you'll notice that they sound good in mono, so your tracks need to sound good in mono too. And you can hear a pretty big difference. So here it is in stereo. And you'll hear it when it switches to mono. Now I've already mixed things, so obviously it doesn't sound as good in mono as it does in stereo, but it still sounds pretty good in mono. You might notice when you switch to mono that certain instruments disappear, and it's kind of a balancing act. You just have to switch back and forth from mono and stereo and try to find the best position for those faders to keep things consistent, but eventually you're going to have to use some good old EQ to carve out those instruments and bring more clarity to the whole mix. So now at this point, when we leave our track completely in mono, and we're going to start EQing. And one thing I did that really helped out that I hadn't done much before was what's called top-down mixing. So I put an EQ on my mix bus here, and this is really cool because instead of just starting with one instrument and making some changes and having to subtly make all these changes little by little, everything you do here is affecting the whole mix, so you're automatically making the mix as a whole sound better. So what I did here, I'm basically just looking for mud, trying to get rid of some of the muffled woofiness down here in these muddy regions, trying to pull out any kind of harsh or just really hunky or any fake sounding frequencies. And then I just added a little shelf just to bring some lift, some more air to the whole orchestra. Another really important thing you need to do that I hadn't done before, and this makes a lot of difference, is when you're adjusting your EQ, you're basically changing the volume of your track. If you're cutting out a lot of stuff, you're essentially making your track quieter. So when you compare it to the original, if the original seems louder than your EQ, then you're probably going to like the original better because we tend to favor louder as better. So you want to make sure that the volume is the same whether your EQ is on or whether it's bypassed. That way you can judge it fairly and tell if your EQ is actually helping or hurting your mix. So in order to have an accurate comparison, you need to add makeup gain. If your track is quieter, you want to add a little bit. So you can see here I actually added 1.5 dB so that when I turn it on and when I bypass it, the volume is roughly the same either way. Then you can hear what the EQ is actually doing. And in this case, it's bringing a lot of clarity and a lot of lift to the mix. So I'm just going to turn it on and off and just have a listen to what it's doing. just hear it really cleans things up and brings in a lot more energy. And keep in mind, when I did this EQ at first, there were no other EQs on these tracks. That was affecting this big muddy mess, and that was very helpful. You could probably send all these sections to a bus. You could send the string section to a bus, you could send the brass to a bus, and the woodwinds to a bus, and so on and so forth. And then you could probably EQ that as a whole, but for whatever reason, I just decided to EQ them individually. The lower instruments, like the bass, you can leave in a lot of that low end. You can see I've only cut off about 45 hertz because that's just mud sub frequencies that you don't really hear. But then all these other instruments that are much higher, you can see I've cut a lot of that out to make room for the low end. That's a move that you wouldn't be able to make on a bus. You can only do that kind of move on the individual tracks, and I like doing that. It really frees up a lot of space for the lower instruments. Again, the EQ is pretty much the same here. I'm basically just looking for mud and turning that stuff down. Any harsh frequencies, I'm turning that stuff down. And then I like to try to find nice frequencies that are really realistic and kind of turn them up just to give a little more life to the instruments. On the piano here, you can see I cut a lot of that unnecessary low end out, leaving room for the bass and the tuba and the bassoon, cutting out some of the mud from these frequencies here and some of the honky frequencies here. And then there's sort of a nice chimey sound at this section here, so I kind of brought that up just so the piano could cut through the mix a little better. Now, the way I used to EQ bass, I would have thought, oh, it's a low instrument, I should boost the low end. But no, the pitch that it's playing in is already a low pitch, so what you want is for that to be presented clearly. I actually cut out a lot of these frequencies here, a lot of these lower frequencies that kind of make it sound muffled and woofy. In this case, the bass sounded really good on its own, but in the mix it was starting to sound kind of thumpy, almost like a finger-picked bass and not, someone playing with a bow. And so I was trying to really carve it out, and I did a boost here just to bring out some of the bite of that string. And then normally doing a move like this, you might think, oh, you're getting rid of all the low end. But that's where that makeup gain comes back. You turn it up to the right volume, and it doesn't get rid of the low end, it just makes it cleaner. So you can hear the difference. So at this point in a mix, I would usually start working on compression, but I felt like it wasn't necessary for this mix. I think in most orchestral stuff, you don't need it. The orchestra really needs that dynamic room to breathe. Compression just doesn't help with that. But I did add a little compression to the piano because those high notes were really peaking. So you can see those high notes are just sort of jumping out of the mix. So I add a little compression just to sort of tame that and give it a more consistent volume. Especially since it's the main instrument, it needs to be sustainable through the whole piece. So compression helps with something like that. Another thing I like to do at this point, I like to create sort of a mastering template. So you can see I have these extra plugins on my mix bus here, but they're all bypassed. I have another EQ and a spread, which is kind of nice. These are some tools that I would use in the mastering phase of things, but especially this, the limiter. You want to bring the volume up of the track to make it really loud, and that's basically compressing the whole track. So you just want to make sure it's not ruining anything. You want to make sure it's not making anything too loud or too quiet. So you might make a few adjustments to balance that out, but then later I would bounce the whole track, bring it into a new project and do all the mastering there. In mastering, I do just a little bit of EQ, not a lot. Maybe one last cut of some mud, a little high pass filter, and a little shelf to add some high end. I like the spread, but I use it very subtly, just about 10%. It just kind of opens things up a little bit. And then I didn't even use compression at all on this. I just let the limiter do all the compressing. Other than that, you might want to automate a few things. And there's a few ways you could use automation. If you compress some things and that's not enough, sometimes automation can be a good tool to keep the volume sounding consistent. The piano sounds great all the way through here, but once all these other instruments hop in, it starts to get kind of quiet. It starts at negative 2.5, and then it goes up just 0.5 dB to negative 2. And then in the second half, it goes up again to negative 1.5 dB. And then it comes back down to 2.5, and then at the end, it fades out. Automation is also really good for adding a little more movement to some instruments. Like the strings at the beginning here, if I turn this automation off, you'll hear that the notes are just kind of like no rise or fall to them at all. And then with automation, it just gives it more movement. So that can be used along with some other tricks to make things sound a little more realistic. Again, I didn't spend too much time with that on this mix. But once you've automated everything, that's pretty much it. You might add some special effects, like I added these sound effects here, the thunder and the rain, just to kind of create some atmosphere, especially since the game takes place on an island. I thought that was kind of a nice little touch to really set that mood. But that's pretty much it. I hope some of these things were helpful to you. I don't usually get to work on this kind of music too much, but I always enjoy it when I do. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to hit that like button and maybe consider subscribing. Until next time.